Hello, so I got a request to do a reacts video to Christopher Hitchens on WMDs and Iraq, and so this is going to be that video. I haven't watched this video before. My understanding of Christopher Hitchens' opinion on Iraq is that the invasion of Iraq, the second one, was justified. He was not a fan of the first Gulf War, but the second Gulf War was necessary because Saddam was such an evil individual, and this is how Christopher Hitchens articulates it, saying that he is evil. I'm not entirely sure if this video is going to be a bit of him kind of flubbing the WMD question and really propping up the WMDs, because I don't know at what point in time this takes place. My understanding is that in his debate with his brother, Peter Hitchens, where they talk about both Iraq and religion, conservative Peter Hitchens is anti-Iraq war and pro-religion, and then leftist, or as he would like to be called, radical, Christopher Hitchens is pro-Iraq war and anti-theist. And so that's a bit of an interesting debate. Somewhat funny seeing like the brotherly interaction as well as, you know, both these two debating. And so let's just jump into this video. I'm a little curious to see what he has to say about WMDs, because in the debate between Peter and Christopher, my recollection is he says the WMDs aren't important, or even if the WMDs aren't there, it's still necessary to invade Iraq. So let's see.
Look, just on this question of the weaponry, and you ought to criticize yourselves for laughing so easily at such cheap points. Here's the fact.
The fact of the matter might not be the fact of the matter, depending on when this is recorded or given, because, you know, information regarding whether or not they're WMDs was kind of dynamic during the early phases of the Second Iraq War.
Here's the fact. Here is a regime that has used them repeatedly on its own soil and the soil of neighbors, that has a special Department of State for concealment, that nearly defeated the heroic United Nations inspector, a great Swedish socialist, Rolf Ekéus, the founder of the first...
So, I believe, I'm not sure exactly if chemical warfare like constitutes weapons of WMDs, but I believe this is to what he's referring to in terms of already used on his own people, and I believe they used it in the invasion of Kuwait, but don't quote me on that.
In his attempts to discover what the truth of the situation was, and always constituted at least a latent, if not a blatant threat, and was always a permanent threat, if not an imminent one. What have we found since the end?
So I think that this is a fair characterization. I think that Saddam would have loved nuclear warheads, but I really don't have a ton of information on the matter, and so like my opinion's not worth a tremendous amount. I'm not an expert on either Saddam or the Iraq War, but what I do know of Saddam, he was not a particularly nice individual, and he was particularly, you know, interested in power. You can find the video where he takes over the government of Iraq when, like, and he purges the parliamentarians who disagree with him, and it's like, it's been a while since I've watched it, but from my recollection, it's a rather horrifying video where, you know, the parliamentarians, one by one, he singles them out and kind of sorts them into two groups, and it's very implicitly understood that one of these groups is to be executed, and they are actually executed by the other group. So all the people disloyal to him get sorted into this group that are going to be tried and summarily executed, and they're going to be executed by the loyalists themselves, which is just haunting. But onward.
Invasion? I'll tell you what we found since the invasion. Dr. Mahdi Obeidi, Saddam's chief nuclear scientist, whose book, The Bomb in My Garden, I thoroughly recommend to you, among other things for its portrayal of the life of a scientist under the Ba'ath Party regime, buried in his garden, and we know he's not making this up because he's produced it, along with several yards of instruction manual, the elements of, in fact, the whole constituent of a nuclear centrifuge, the most important element in the creation of a nuclear weapon. He buried it under the orders of Hussein.
So a WMD, or all the like parts of a WMD, seems like a rather small distinction to be made. You know, it's a technical distinction, but if someone has all the parts of, you know, a WMD buried, they effectively have a WMD buried. But again, I'm not sure. It's reasonable that this guy would have had something against Saddam, considering what Saddam was like, and may have exaggerated or something like this. I don't know the details of whether or not this guy that Hitchens is invoking is either planting something, or, you know, if there's like legitimate claims. But Onward.
One of Saddam's two charming possible successors, if we'd let it run, who was in charge of the concealment program. We have that centrifuge now. The United Nations inspectors would never have found it, even if they'd been looking.
Although it does seem a bit gratuitous to build a centrifuge specifically just so that you can turn it over and make Saddam look bad. So that's something, although the details and like the nuances of this, I'm not abundantly... my understanding is that the general conclusion is that there were no WMDs. And so hearing Christopher Hitchens talk about this, either something is not true, and it's unclear to me which is not true, which is that the general consensus is wrong and there were WMDs, which I don't think is the case, or Christopher Hitchens is mistaken in some way, which is, I think, to be the case, but I don't have the deeper dive knowledge. This would have to be something I'd look into.
We also find the CD account, the whole minutes of a meeting is as late as March 2003, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, in Damascus, between Saddam Hussein's envoys and those of Kim Jong-il, to buy from North Korea off the shelf the long-range missiles that Iraq was prohibited from making by the sanctions. I'm afraid to say Dr. Parenti is quite wrong, but both inquiries in Washington and in London have found that there were indeed ongoing attempts by Saddam Hussein's agents to buy uranium in West Africa.
Both of these seem very plausible and believable, that he was trying to buy both uranium and also the warhead, or not the warheads, the missiles from North Korea.
Perhaps for recreational purposes, but there comes a point where one thinks that this regime is not entitled to the presumption of innocence. And here's...
This is something I really like about Christopher Hitchens, is he is willing to, go after individuals, this presumption of innocence thing. He is willing to say, like, if it looks like a fox and smells like a fox, it's probably a fox. If it looks like a WMD and smells like a WMD, it's probably a WMD. He is very critical of the West's, desire to, for political expediency, engage with characters that definitely look nefarious, but with plausible deniability. I find this particularly timely, at least in the case of Putin, where the West has, for the past, 20 years, been engaging in very ways that are very favorable to Russia, and kind of looking the other way, in regards to, like, the authoritarianism and, like, the human rights violations. And, Putin, under every single president except for Trump, although I don't think that, I'm not trying to say that Trump is the reason, Putin has invaded a sovereign country. He invaded Georgia under Bush. He invaded Ukraine under, Obama. He invaded Ukraine again under Biden. And, it's this, since he's come to power, he also, like, you could talk to the Chechens about what's going on there, whether or not he, like, that constitutes an invasion or, putting down a rebellion. But I don't have the details on Chechnya too much. But this thing is like, the West have just given a ton of platitudes and engagement. We've allowed Russia and the oligarchs access to all of the financial institutions of the West, and ability to, like, access to the trade and all these sorts of things, which has been a form of engagement, and kind of swept the human rights sort of stuff under the rug throughout the years under a veneer of plausible deniability. Like, the U.S. president's calling Putin to congratulate him on his election victories is just, like, an absolute farce, because those aren't real elections, and they haven't been for some time. I don't think any of his elections, except for maybe the one against Yeltsin. I believe he ran against Yeltsin, or if he didn't run against Yeltsin, his first election might have been legitimate. Of course, it was problematic in other ways. And so this thing where he's, like, saying, look, if it looks like they're trying to build bombs, they're probably trying to build bombs, to some degree resonates with me, but it's also dangerous, obviously, because this is a slippery slope to say, if it looks like it, we're just going to assume it, even though we don't have all the evidence. And, it's a slippery slope, but this is something I like about Hitchens, because you don't see this often at the left. Very often on the left, you see, like, kind of the placatey type of, wait and see type of attitude, which, Christopher Hitchens, in my mind, I like him a lot because he often diverges from the way people on the left normally do things. He's like very aggressive. He's a I don't want to say to some degree he's a provocateur, but the word I would want to use I forget right now. But he's a polemicist. He goes after people, and he's also very, very sharp, and he tends to have a high fidelity to the facts. And so listening to him talking about WMDs is interesting.
Well, you have to be responsible. You have to imagine what you might have to do yourself if you were in power and you knew that there was such a regime. Would you say, well, let's give them another chance? Would you say they're entitled to the benefit of any doubt? Remember, at all times there is sniping, quite correctly, from those who say that the warning signs from Afghanistan, a militarily negligible country, were being ignored by the administration. Would anyone have decided to take Saddam Hussein's word for it in this context? The Dwelfer report, the recent UN report on the evacuation of nuclear and yellow cake sites in Iraq showed that Iraq was, at the time of its invasion, a functioning WMD state with all the latent potential and all the concealment, all the expertise and all the technique that was needed to revive that program once the sanctions had ceased to operate, which they were ceasing to do.
So this is an important distinction where he's saying, look, he's not explicitly saying there weren't WMDs, but saying someone has the capacity and the will and like all the sorts of things in place, and then sanctions are about to be lifted. This is a bit concerning. Of course, I do not, I would like to vet the information myself, but this is, it is a distinction that comports with both the general sort of narrative that there were no WMDs, and also saying that, look, there's reason to just someone not currently having WMDs and someone about to have WMDs is a meaningful distinction in terms of saying whether or not they have them, but it's not a meaningful distinction in terms of like the effect of them having them, because they're effectively the same thing, even though technically they're not the same thing. Someone about to have WMDs is effectively having WMDs from a geopolitical perspective, but from like an Aristotelian logic perspective, they don't have WMDs. But it's a frivolous distinction, and so one you would make if you were trying to like poo-poo the war. Now, of course, I don't have a very, very strong opinion on the Iraq War, largely because of conflicting information such as this, and I just don't have, for me, I don't think it's worth exploring because it's not going to affect like forward-looking behavior and opinions, although generally I'm not a fan of America sticking their finger in other countries' pies.
On plain facts, they're available to anybody, and they're not to be sneered at or about. Otherwise, why would Hans Blix have said before the war that he didn't know how much would be found, but he knew there would have to be something? Why would Gerhard Schroeder's intelligence have said that Saddam Hussein was anything from 5 to 10 years away? They kept changing the figure, from a functioning thermonuclear weapon. Why would Mr. Chirac, who after all had built Saddam Hussein a nuclear reactor, knowing what he wanted it for, while retaining his veto at the United Nations, have said the same? Why did I have to debate in the 5 months before the war began every night with members of the anti-war movement who said, you can't invade Iraq, their weapons of mass destruction will kill thousands and thousands of our soldiers. You can look that up.
This is kind of, I think, a meaningful point to make, that the if the anti-war people argument before the war is you can't do it because the WMDs are gonna like blow people up, and then the anti-war like perspective after it is like saying, why did you invade? There are no WMDs. This is an obvious like post hoc like reconstruction. Now, I'm not familiar with what the anti-war movement looked like, beforehand, but if they're saying that there are WMDs and everyone's saying that they're WMDs, it's reasonable. Christopher Hitchens is like laying out, look, all these people who have knowledge on the matter and a reasonable reason for thinking that he has WMDs are saying that he probably has WMDs. It's reasonable at the time of the execution of the invasion to make such an invasion, which to me makes sense. But obviously, post-hoc, we discovered that there aren't any WMDs. But again, small distinction. there's a logical distinction between not having WMDs or having WMDs and having all the means and like immediate ability to create WMDs. There's a logical distinction, but there's not a practical distinction.
Too, if there's anyone here from MoveOn.org or any other such heroic organization, that's what you guys were saying then. So this is not a confection. It's a Hitlerian pounding has its own reward, I see on the platform. This is not a confection. It's a reasoned judgment about the existence of an intolerable threat, and it was very soundly...
Yeah. There's a difference between, like, okay, so the people who insisted they were there were wrong to insist that they're there, but the people who are saying there's a reasonable, there's a reasonable argument for them being there, that's a different thing. And to my knowledge, which again is not it's not expansive on the Iraq War, because I don't think that this is necessarily something worth thinking about. It doesn't seem to be. I've lost my train of thought, but I think that people making a reasonable argument, you have to act on like reasonable information and not certainty in terms of like practical action. And so I certainly think that Christopher Hitchens is like creating an argument that is consistent with the narrative, but also like disturbing, and like it makes me want to look into it more, but at the same time I don't think it's necessarily something worth thinking about. But I think that what's worth thinking about is like looking at Christopher Hitchens' kind of approach and opinion, especially taking note of what people were saying, before they had the information that there were no WMDs. And one of their arguments is, look, they have WMDs, we can't invade. And then post hoc, they're like, why did we invade? They had no WMDs. Obviously it is a post hoc analysis, which is something that pundits are very, very good at, but is not, when you are trying to think about what the right decision to make is, it's not something that's useful at all. Political pundits are actually terrible at predicting events, but they're really, really good at making post hoc analysis that makes it sound like they knew what was going to happen, but it didn't. You can find evidence for this in Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about how a lot of experts in a lot of different fields aren't really good at predicting anything. They're just good at post hoc analysis.
Evidentially based. The gentleman asks, in reference to what I said about the discovery of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq after the invasion, whether these were enough to constitute a threat, and whether or not they were. I think he implied, in any case, why doesn't the administration mention them? In other words, why are you hearing about this from me if it's true, is the subtext of the question.
The question I find interesting, too, because the points he made are not ones that I had heard before, but are, like, salient, and they don't give a guarantee of weapons of mass destruction. And so perhaps the thing that's most wrong with the WMD's narrative is the messaging, saying it's certain that they're there, not just it's reasonable to believe that they're there.
But I hope that's a fair précis of yeah. Well, it is a good question, and I do know the answer to it. The administration is, despite the relative success of its presentation as a united front on message, line of the day administration, the most riven with internal hatreds and rivalries of any administration, I would say, since the Second World War. There is open hatred and contempt between the State Department and the CIA and the State Department, State and CIA against DoD defense. I've never heard in private anything like the sorts of things that they say. They refer to each other as traitors, not as wrong-headed. There's a real blood about this, and the main quarrel has been over regime change in Iraq and the determination of the CIA to sabotage it. The short answer to your question is this. If the administration said that Dr. Mehdi Obeidi's book should be read by everybody and they should pay attention to the fact that Uday and Qusay Hussein were able to bury nuclear centrifuges, the next day the CIA would say this had been exaggerated. And the resulting leak would make it worse for the administration than if they'd said nothing at all. So that's why, ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, brothers and sisters, your republic is so messed up that the case has to be made by me. I have to volunteer to do what the Bush administration can't do for itself. How do you like that? I don't like it that much, but I'm willing to do it. Because I have an obligation to the truth, and it simply is not true to say that there was no WMD problem in Iraq. Flat out not true.
Again, there's a distinction between no WMD problem and no WMDs that I think is important to emphasize. And Hitchens here has not once said that there are definitely WMDs, but instead it's a more nuanced argument, which is that it's reasonable to believe that there would be there. And I think that this is... it's something that's often like lost. The nuance of this type of distinction is often lost when you are in politics and messiness. And let's just get through the end of the video and then I'll talk.
And I can give any of you any time documentary and evidentiary proof of that.
Okay, so that was the whole video. I had it on loop so you didn't see what it would recommend to me because it's tailored to me, not necessarily having to do with Hitch. And yeah, I think that this video, thank you for the recommendation, by the way, because I have not seen this before, but it is a bit eye-opening. Also, I'm trying to think where exactly in the I believe in his debate with Peter Hitchens, and if anyone has watched that recently and wants to let me know, he did say, like, leave aside the WMDs. And so, to my mind, this debate takes place after, and it's possible that Christopher Hitchens got new information which changed his analysis on the WMDs such that he thought that the information pointing to WMDs was not reliable or something like this, because why would you say leave it aside if it's like definitely a thing? But maybe you say it's leave it aside because it's a generally accepted consensus that there were no WMDs. But in his debate with Hitchens, he's like, leave the WMDs aside, you still have to invade Iraq because Saddam is so bad. Which I think is overall his position, and the main reason I think he is pro-invasion of Iraq, to my understanding, even despite this video where he's talking about WMDs, is because of Saddam was an enemy of humanity. Christopher Hitchens identifies as a humanist, which means he cares about, people from all countries. It's like, in some sense, you can think of it as the opposite of a nationalist, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And so it's just that Saddam is so bad that you have to get rid of him. But as far as this video goes, I think it's a little bit more nuanced in that it talks about, potential and reasonable to, like, believe that there's WMDs there. And it's, looking for these guaranteed things before acting is kind of, at the very minimum, the mistake that I think the West makes, and specifically it made with Putin, which is something I know more about than Saddam, is that the West provides engagement to its economic tools. It allows for foreign investment from, like, the West to, like, Russia and all these sorts of things, engagement in terms of trade, the financial institutions, so the oligarchs can take advantage of them, which are, like, an essential to their functioning, all these Western financial institutions. It provides all this engagement sort of free of compliance with Western values, which I don't think it should. And the reason it does this free of compliance is under a guise of plausible deniability, or even possible deniability is probably a better phrasing, not just plausible deniability, but, like, if there's a shred of a chance that something is not the case, then they just provide engagement, which was the case with Putin. And now you get to see, like, the effects of that, like, long term is it's not good. And so I don't know if the calculus should necessarily be an invasion of Iraq, but it because I really don't I'm not well enough informed on the matter, but it is, the West should not be providing engagement with Iraq. Something that is, again, this is not a thing I know too much about, but the West has engaged quite favorably with Saudi Arabia, favorably for the Saudis, and provides weapons and, like, a lot of trade and stuff like this. And okay, to some degree, the West is also hamstringed by its need for oil, and so this is, like, a complicated geopolitical matter. But, perhaps we should not be engaging and providing weapons to the Saudis just so they can drop bombs in Yemen. And this is kind of a similar type of question as, the engagement with Putin, the engagement to the degree we did engage with Saddam. And I think that, generally speaking, there should be kind of a line in the sand, which is you are not allowed to invade neighboring sovereign states. Although perhaps there's some asterisks needed, but I don't want to sort that out right now. But the point is that, that seems like a fairly definitive point at which you should heavily sanction, deny engagement. A lot of the things that are coming down in terms of sanctions for Putin now should have been present after his invasion of Georgia, where he annexed Georgian land. And so, although I know much less about the Georgian invasion than I do like more recent events, but it's the plausible deniability and engagement. It's this like sort of placating beverage that is fed to us, where it's saying like, look, if it looks like something, you got to address it based on what it's looked like. And I understand the dangers of like such thinking, because it can allow you to push too far and like be too aggressive, but at the same time, you cannot allow the need for certainty necessarily to, it's an awfully high horse you have to sit on in order to need certainty in order to do things, because this is a very uncertain world. And when you have a lot of strong evidence that there's WMDs, you have to make a decision based on the evidence you have. And maybe someone fed you bad evidence, and that's okay. You have to make an evaluation. You have to look at the evidence you have, try and determine how reliable you think the evidence is you have, and then you have to make a decision. And the decision is good or not on the basis of if you were correct in predicting that there were WMDs there, but on the basis of, with the information you had at the time you made the decision, was the decision good? And you can't evaluate decisions based on a post hoc analysis of whether or not there are WMDs there, because that's not how decision making works. Decision making does not work in a post hoc like analysis world. Now, post hoc, you can look at it and use that as a data point, like say, look how we were wrong with the WMDs in Iraq. But you can't, I think if the evidence looks like it's there, you can't say the decision-making was bad at the time if all the evidence points to that. You can say that some of the evidence was bad. You can say that there was corruption in presenting bad evidence, and that this is the site at which you should be critical, not the decision-making itself in light of bad evidence. Again, I'm not sure to the degree of all the things Hitchens mentioned what evidence was good or bad, but it's just kind of, thinking about decision-making in a vacuum. And Hitchens tends to be very precise. At no point he said there were definitely WMDs here, unless I'm horribly mistaken. If I am, feel free to let me know. But at no point is he saying they're definitely there. And this might have been before it was kind of discovered that they weren't really there. And so, I think it's that precision and nuance is also important, but is often lost in translation of, the 15-second clip, which is like kind of the attention span where, if someone was characterizing Hitchens here, I think they would say he said that there were WMDs in Iraq, which is not what he said. He said it's reasonable to believe that they're there. And then, it's a messy game of logical telephone where things don't get transferred on properly. Anyways, if you like this video, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. If you have suggestions in terms of reacts videos, especially, I suppose, someone other than Hitchens, although I'm more than happy to watch more Hitchens, feel free to let me know in the comments section. Also, have a good day.